Why did I do that? I have no... Jesus Christ. Hey pals, my name is Blaine and you're watching Blaine's World of Reviews. Today we're taking a look at our first movie in our MCU series, which is 2008's Iron Man. If you're new to the channel and you didn't get a chance to see my previous video, which was sort of the blueprint for what we're doing for the next couple of months on the channel, I will leave that in the description down below so you get a chance to see what it is that we're doing. But basically, we're going to start from the beginning of the MCU in chronological order as far as when they were released. So that means that we're starting off today with Iron Man. I'm so excited to get started, so let's get going. Now before we get started, I do want to note that this will be a spoilerific video, so there will be a bunch of spoilers for this movie. So if you have not seen Iron Man somehow, this 14-year-old movie, then I do recommend going and watching it for yourself and then coming on back to this video to watch my thoughts on it. But we will be going in depth on my thoughts and feelings on this movie. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So just having rewatched this film, I am so impressed with Robert Downey Jr. as an actor. I know that that's not a hot take whatsoever. He's an incredible performer, but in this movie you have to remember what had been going on at the time. He hadn't been in a lot of things, and so whenever he came back on screen as this character and knocked it out of the park, it was sort of a return to form for him, and he is incredible in this movie. Like, I know that, like I said, that's not a big hot take or anything like that, but he's phenomenal. Like, he does so much with making Tony Stark this sort of arrogant asshole at the beginning of the movie that you wouldn't want to be around unless you were, aware of what his sense of humor was like. But then by the end of this movie, he's still that guy, but you can tell he's a lot more noble. You can see the character progression throughout just this one film. And if, God forbid, the MCU never happened, this movie is such a wonderful standalone story. And I think that's what makes it so lasting. And I think it's why it was able to springboard the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe from this one film. Now, one of my favorite parts of this movie is the relationship between Tony Stark and Pepper Potts, played wonderfully by Gwyneth Paltrow. I think that she is honestly underrated in these movies. I think that she's a great foil for Tony Stark as a character, and I think that their relationship is so believable. It's one of the best parts and one of the best relationships in the entire MCU, and you get to see it grow from this movie to the very end. This isn't like one of those relationships in the MCU that just comes out of nowhere. They really built this over time. At the end of this movie, there's not a big smooch, there's not a big kiss scene, there's not a big, wonderful moment where they're a couple and then it just ends like most superhero movies do. They built this over time. They built this relationship and made it really, really real and realistic, and I think that it's really a testament to these actors and the direction that they decided to go with these movies, that they didn't just make it a easy fix, an easy relationship. They really took their time in building this and they made it feel a lot more realistic, and it makes Pepper a lot stronger of a character, and I think that she's one of the best female leads in the entire MCU. Now, rounding out the cast in this movie, you also have Terrence Howard starring as Rhodey, or War Machine as he's later known as. And I gotta admit, I'm really sad that Terrence Howard didn't get to go on to be in the part any longer, because I really do like his performance in this movie. He's good at playing the sort of hard-ass military man, but also he's a believable friend of Tony's. And so it's a little bit sad that he wasn't able or wasn't wanting to continue on in the pictures after this one, because I really do think that he has a good chemistry with Robert Downey Jr. I think their characters bounce off well off of one another, and so it is a little bit sad that this is the only film that he's involved in. But I do think that Don Cheadle was a great replacement and a good Rhodey going forward. Now, I have to say, my favorite part of this movie has to be the very beginning when Tony is captured and kept in the cave with Yinsen. These two really bounce off of each other really well, and them building the Mark I suit, which is actually one of my favorite suits in the entire MCU Iron Man timeline. I think that it's honestly so cool, and I think it's a perfect representation of what the comic Mark 1 looked like, which is kind of crazy because a lot of times nowadays the MCU will take comic suits and they add like a bunch of extra symmetry, extra lines to make it look more modern, whereas this Mark 1 suit is almost exactly what it's like in the comics, and it looks incredible. It's a perfect representation, and it shows that sometimes comic book looks, while looking a little bit goofy, can be functional and look just as badass and super cool, as well as being a little superhero goofy. Now, as far as the plot for this movie goes, I'm so impressed with how this movie handles the story, because you have to go back to when this movie came out. Iron Man wasn't really a household superhero, and so this movie is really what popularized the character, and if not for how they handled the story and without Jon Favreau's wonderful direction, I don't think it would have been as successful as it was. You've got this fantastic story about a billionaire who starts off as this just insufferable asshole who then goes through a very traumatic experience, which, by the way, for this being like an MCU movie, you can tell that they hadn't fully gotten into the whole MCU yet, because this has some brutal moments in it. There's an entire scene where Tony Stark is getting essentially waterboarded or drowned for torture. There's also a scene where Jensen has a molten ball put into his mouth to get him to talk. Like, there are a lot of darker scenes that you will not see later on in the MCU that they are able to get away with now, because this was the first one in the series. They were still kind of figuring everything out. So I love this movie for that. I like to see those little darker edges that they kind of went towards at the beginning of the MCU. And I do wish that that would have continued, because overall, I think that it works in this movie and it doesn't go too far into a dark direction. There's just enough there to where it really balances out some of the more comedic parts of the movie. But as I was saying, that entire beginning part of them building the Mark 1 suit, their relationship forming, this sort of, I don't even know, this brotherhood that these two characters build together is really heartwarming, and it gives a great catalyst for Tony's development and his arc throughout the rest of the movie. And I think that they really just nailed this beginning part. And then by the time he's out of that cave, you feel so pumped. There is so much energy in this movie, and you are just on the edge of your seat. I mean, I've seen this movie 1,000 times, and at that moment, whenever Tony is outside of the cave, blowing dudes up, being super brutal, I'm still on the edge of my seat, even though I know exactly what's going to happen. And while we're on the topic of the action and effects in this movie, I do have to say that the effects in this film kind of hold up for a 14-year-old movie. I mean, there are a few scenes, especially towards the end, where it can look a little bit wonky, but in the beginning of the movie, I'm not sure if the suit was all practical, but I do know that there's a lot of attention to detail in the way that these suits look, and I honestly think the Mark 1, 2, and 3 in this movie look a lot better than some of the suits that come a lot later down the line, and I think that this movie has the best suits of the entire franchise. I'm just going to put that out there. This movie has some great action direction as well. My favorite action scene of the entire movie is whenever Tony comes in to save the hostages while he's in his Mark III armor for the first time, and he comes in and just decimates all of these jerks that had him in the cave beforehand. Whatever was left from this terrorist organization, he mops the floor with them. And like I said earlier, they get a lot darker in this movie and a lot more brutal than they're able to do further down the line. And there's something so satisfying about watching him just beat the shit out of all of these guys, blow up tanks. I mean, it's really impressive what they were able to do with this first film, especially because there was no MCU at the time. This was the first one, and the fact that they were able to have such great action and such iconic moments that would be replicated in further films is really a testament to the writers, directors, performers, everybody involved. This really was just a great sort of lightning in a bottle that made this whole universe possible, and I'm just so impressed with what they were able to accomplish. Another major positive that this movie has going for it is the fact that because it's the first movie in the MCU, it really does have less baggage around it in terms of needing to set up other things, which is kind of a weird thing to say because you would think that a first movie in a franchise like this would need to set up a whole bunch of other shit and get the whole universe started and going, and you would need a billion different Easter eggs, because that's what a lot of franchises later down the line tried to do. But this first film really isn't interested in that. There are a few cameos, a few little nods to other characters, like the Captain America shield you can spot in the background, but those are Easter eggs, as they're supposed to be. They're not things that derail the plot. Now, of course, you have more involved parts of the plot, like Phil Coulson, who's a part of S.H.I.E.L.D., but again, he doesn't derail the plot. If anything, he is a part of it. And the one big moment for the entire movie that is sort of a commercial for possible other movies to come is the post-credit scene, which is where it belongs. It's at the end of the movie. It gets you excited for other movies because the other story has already been told. So when you see Samuel L. Jackson on the screen and his very first performance as Nick Fury, you're super excited because now this story has been told, and now there are possibly more stories to be told in the future, if that makes sense. So I really like that this movie is its own thing, and it doesn't rely on getting people excited for future movies in order to get them in the seat. Now, I do have to say this movie is not without its flaws, and I will say that the biggest flaw in this film is the villain. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before. I know that it's a big cliche in Marvel movies that the villains aren't always great. But the thing that makes me a little bit sad about this villain in particular, played by Jeff Bridges, is he really is kind of intriguing for the first one half, maybe 2/3 of the movie. I think that Jeff Bridges gives a really good performance, but the second he gets into the mustache twirling, building the iron suit, like murderer, he really loses a lot of that steam. And then they do the big cliche kill the villain ending, which, if you know me well enough, you know that I hate it when these superhero movies kill the villain. I do think that there are times where it makes sense and it's the only way out in the story, but there are times like in this movie where the villain didn't get a lot of time to cook, and so by the time you're at the end of the movie and he dies, you're like, okay, well, that was like a little squabble, and now they're done. And so I do feel that I wish that we got a little bit more time with Jeff Bridges outside of the suit, getting to see his resentment for Tony as a character, and getting to see his hatred for what the company is currently or what it's heading towards. And then it might have been a little bit more believable. My other issue with the villain of this film is at the beginning of the movie, he's kind of in the background and he's hiring people to hurt Tony, which makes sense. He's a businessman. He doesn't want to get his hands dirty. But then by the end of this movie, the switch happens so quick from he's wanting to be so uninvolved with it that he would hire a group to murder Tony, that then he's trying to murder Pepper in a car with a family in it at one point. Like, he goes so evil so fast, and it didn't feel very earned. Now, that's not to say that the performance isn't good, because I think Jeff Bridges really does put in a really good performance here. And without him in the part, I think that it would have been a lot worse. But I do think that they just take this character into places that don't really make sense for him, especially once you see what he's like at the beginning of the movie. It's just like, it doesn't feel like it meshes well. But I don't think that that's enough to tank this movie whatsoever. So, of course, I don't think I'm blowing anybody's mind when I say that this movie still holds up today. Like, this is one of the best examples of an origin story Marvel film. It gives you everything you need to, and honestly, they balance the tone in this movie so well. The comedy, the action, the dark elements, they all work together, and it doesn't feel mismatched. And the pacing in this movie is phenomenal. It feels like, honestly, I feel like this movie is like only an hour long when I get done with it. It feels like it rushes by so quickly, and that, I mean, is a good thing. I mean, the whole thing just feels so together and so snappy and so perfect. And honestly, if the whole MCU didn't happen off of this movie, this would still be a phenomenal picture on its own. And if you haven't watched this in a while, I strongly recommend going back to take a look at it, because it's definitely worth a rewatch. So on my channel, I'm going to grade things on a scale of 0 to 10, yes, 0. I do think that there are some movies that are just completely unredeemable that deserve a 0, but trust me, Iron Man's definitely not going to get that. This movie gets a 9 out of 10. I give it a 9 out of 10. It's just shy of being perfect just because of the sloppiness of the villain and how he's handled in this movie. But that doesn't detract overall from this being an incredible film and one that deserves the sort of hype around it and everything that came afterwards. I really, really enjoyed this movie, and honestly, I think it's one of the most rewatchable films in the entire franchise because it doesn't have the baggage of the rest of the MCU on top of it. You really can just watch this movie on its own and enjoy yourself, and I really, really recommend it. If you guys are following along with me, I definitely don't recommend skipping this one because this needs to be seen. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on Iron Man 1. That's one down and about 20 million other movies and TV shows to go. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to watch my previous video, I'll have that linked down in the description. And of course, if you want to keep up to date with what I'm doing here on the channel, you can click subscribe and click on that bell icon, and that'll give you notifications for whenever I'm uploading. Also, please feel free to drop a like on this video down below. That always just lets me know that you're watching, and it just brings a smile to my face. And leave some comments on what you'd like to see me review in the future as well.